We're back with Sekulow and Bill Faloon. A moment ago we mentioned your colleague, Floyd Abrams.
Yeah.
You were going to say something about
Yeah,
that.
I followed Floyd, of course, for years. I think one of the best First Amendment lawyers in the country. We had a case, 4 of us on our side, 4 on the government side on the campaign finance reform back in 2003. So I got to argue a case with Floyd Abrams. So it was quite an honor. Good guy, smart.
You started so many years ago with the IRS.
As my wife likes to remind me. I was interviewed on a program and I said, well, I was at the IRS. We didn't do that. And then when I got home, my wife said, yeah, when you were at the IRS 250 years ago. No, it's 35 years. It's been a long time. 1980. Long time. 36 years ago. But go ahead.
So back then you were an esteemed employee of the IRS.
I was
and then
a junior lawyer right out of the gate. Yep.
And your views have changed somewhat since then.
Well, no, you know, I always viewed my job as an IRS lawyer as nonpartisan. So it wasn't so much views change. My views were that our job was to enforce the tax code. And I will recall we had a 35th year reunion in my class, my incoming class 79-80, into the IRS, and all my old bosses were there. And they, you know, they're now in their mid-80s, and we were talking, and I'll never forget the regional counsel, Jack Morton, and some of the other guys and gals I worked with. And we were talking about of course, obviously the case was in the news then, so they were all asking me about it. And I said to Jack, I said, you know, I was in your office, you know, a zillion times. I never had a political conversation with you. We always talk, here's the law, here's how I think it applies or doesn't apply, we should concede this case, try this case. That's what I did. It's very different now. It's just very different now. But those were the days. I still do tax work, because I like tax.
Well, the public should be aware of the frightening aspect of what you're describing, meaning if you're on the wrong side of the political spectrum, you're facing IRS intrusion into your business, your personal life.
In ways you can't even imagine. So it's not just you're denying your tax-exempt status. It's the intrusive nature of the investigation itself. So the tax-exempt status is where this resolves itself. You know, you get your tax-exempt status or you don't. Where this is really dangerous, in my view, is the whole process. The questions that they're asking people. For instance, I mentioned this one about the group that went into the high schools and taught. They wanted the names of the students. Now, if you were a parent of a 15-year-old, would you want somebody giving the IRS the name of your kid? Answer no. That's in the book, but again, this is where you've got to really be diligent. So it's the process itself that's problematic.
Well, also, if you gain your exempt status, the IRS can arbitrarily revoke it.
Well, this is, you know, the revocation process is in the morning they wake up and how do they feel? Now, you can fight back, but again, you know, things are stacked against you in the process. Now, you know, we've been successful, but it's a lot of litigation. If the groups we represented, which could never have afforded our services if we were just charging them, they couldn't afford to get lawyers to do this at this level, where you're in federal court in Washington, D.C., and they're in Cincinnati, or they're out in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Right.
I mean, they just couldn't do it. So, you know, fortunately, these groups like ours. But the reality is, when the IRS first said this whole thing was, you remember the initial thing was, well, this is all one office in Cincinnati. I already had the letters, Bill, had the letters from the other offices, including letters signed by Lois Lerner, from Washington, from California, from Albuquerque, New Mexico. This wasn't blaming this on the agents was absurd, frankly.
You know what's so interesting is if you lie to a federal agent, it's a felony.
Right.
And a lot of famous people have gone to jail only for not telling the truth. But the federal agents and the people running the agencies...
You can never hold them accountable.
Yeah.
There's an action called Bivens. And this is a civil action you can bring when an agent, a government agent, does something wrong. The standard is so high. The barriers to bringing that claim so I'm litigating it right now in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals.
Good.
But it's so high that to make the case, it's almost impossible. So it's almost as if they have immunity. That's another thing I think needs to be eliminated. If they do wrong, I mean, I have a couple of theories. One is, any expenditure that's a government regulation that costs the taxpayers over $10 million, guess what? The IRS doesn't get to do it, period. You know what that will end? Most of the regulations, because almost everything costs more than $10 million. Secondly, the agents have to be accountable if they've knowingly violated the law. And this idea where they get a pass has got to stop.
Well, ending sovereign immunity would be a huge step forward. That would mean accountability for the government employees, just like private citizens have.
Well, that's what it should be. You know, this whole idea that they can do this without it is a bit absurd. But nevertheless, we don't have it right now. So this is things you got to fight for. And again, elections have consequences. And you got an unusual situation in the last 8 years. You've had the administration in lockstep with the bureaucrats. And that makes it worse. But the truth of the matter is, even under administrations that are more friendly, these agencies, very hard to control. Very, very hard to control.
Well, they're lifetime employees.
You can't remove them. If you do, you start literally a federal case. I mean, if you're trying to remove one of these employees, you make the saying you're making a federal case out of it. Literally becomes a federal case.
You mentioned in your book it can cost millions of dollars to fire a federal employee. It's such
more than they make.
Yeah.
I mean, this is it is basically a lifetime appointment, and that's really part of the problem here.
Incredible.
It is.
And right now, they make more than the private sector. They have guaranteed pensions and health care plans that the private sector doesn't have anymore.
I had an agent it was not supposed to be one of the conservative cases, but one of the groups, lawyers, ends up getting audited. So the group was representing a group, he gets audited. His law firm, nonprofit law firm.
Wow.
I took the case for the lawyer. And I mean, and one of my associates handled it with me, and I was pretty tough on that agent. I said, listen, I don't know you, you don't know me. Let me tell you what you need to know. I'm litigating 34 cases against the Internal Revenue Service right now today. You could be 35th. Because why in the world, for a small organization, annual budget under $1 million? Well under $1 million, probably $400,000 or $500,000 a year. I said, why in the world did you pick them, audit them? You're auditing the big hospitals, okay, you're auditing this and that, all right, I get it. What are you possibly going to get out of them? And I said, it's not because that they took the case against you, is it? Yeah, no, of course not. So we handled it very, very aggressively and got it resolved quickly. But again, Bob Tyler shouldn't have had to go through that.
Really?
We did. But we really, it was right after when all this was fresh, so we went after it pretty aggressively. Yeah.
Well, that fear of retaliation is what keeps more Americans from standing up and saying, hey, we got to change the system.
Look, I mean, if you're talking about another agency, there's no agency that, and you deal with the FDA, but another agency, I deal with the IRS, FEC, Department of Justice. Who invokes the most fear?
Well, IRS,
even more than DOJ generally. I mean, this is a systemic problem that has to be systemically eliminated. You've got to have a system in place to change this system. It's not going to get better, as I said, with age. So you've got to work it through.
Well, our position is the IRS bureaucracy is denying the United States the prosperity that it might otherwise enjoy if it were not so for these abusive audits, the fear of audits, the passive compliance issues where companies are spending millions of dollars just to make sure they don't get in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, because in addition to your audit and you got to pay, you have the whole compliance side. We have it. We've got a compliance department to make sure, and you want to have a compliance department. It shouldn't have to be at the level they're at.
Yeah.
But that's the reality. Look, institutionally, we've been audited before. I know what it's like. You spend hundreds of thousands of dollars for them eventually to say, everything's fine, which they do. In 90% of the cases, do not revoke the tax exempt status is not revoked. Over 90% of the cases, they're not revoked. But the process that you go through, a lot of people just give up. People just say, I'm done.
It can be expensive.
Yeah.
I can tell you with life extension, we have had to bring in a lot of compliance people and pay them a lot of money, and they don't really accomplish a lot. A little bit, but not.
Yeah, what they're doing, it's like life insurance. You got to have some.
Yes.
And that's what you're doing. But this is, look, this nature of the system, you'll be glad you have the department. However, again, it shouldn't be in this. We should not be in that situation right now.
Absolutely not. Bill, tell Jay a little bit about the atrocities that we perpetrated against you in your career.
Well, Life Extension was founded in 1977. About 10 years later, FDA decided to shut us down. They raided our premises. They seized everything we had. They thought they put us out of business. We restocked and kept doing it.
Right.
They seized everything we had again in 1990, and we again restocked and kept doing it. We won some court cases, though. We prevented them from keeping the products they kept. We were able to get products back. Then we were indicted in 1991, and we fought them for 4 years. The Department of Justice, after 4 years of motions and of arguments, the Department of Justice filed a motion to dismiss their own indictment.
Against your company.
Against us.
So I put in the book about Gibson Guitar.
Right, incredible.
Okay, so, unbelievable story. So Gibson Guitar has been around since Nashville, Tennessee. I mean, they're a huge company. American-made guitars, which is unheard of today.
Right.
And the government doesn't like the wood on a tree. That came from a tree, obviously, wood. Not that was on a endangered species here in the United States, but some international one. I assure you that Gibson Guitar was not trying to violate. They came in with agents, with the weapons, like they were seized, and they seized the wood. They actually got the case resolved because the head of Gibson Guitar said, I'm going to fight them, and then was able to get them basically to cave. They got the wood back. I've got one of the guitars.
Oh,
It's called the Government Series.
I've had U.S. Marshals put a gun to my head to put the phone down when they would raid our place. Yes, they kick our doors in with the SWAT teams and everything else.
How's it been the last 15 or 20 years?
Good. FDA's been behaving.
Yeah.
So we're grateful for that. A lot of that had to do with in 1994, a bill was passed in Congress that we initiated, the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act.
Yeah.
It lets us make truthful, non-misleading claims about what dietary supplements may do.
Not approved by the FDA.
Right. We just have to say it's not a disease prevention or treatment claim, but at least we can make a structure function claim about what a nutrient may do for somebody. Before 1994, that was illegal.
Yeah.
And all this gets around to the First Amendment. When we were told in 1987 that we couldn't make these claims, we said, well, we have this First Amendment.
Right.
Of course we can make these claims, but legally we couldn't. We had to get the law changed 7 years later, in 1994.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, this is, again, it's a regulation. I just was at a college in Minnesota, and they had a class on called Regulation Nation. And we talked about all this. Yeah. So they talked about it. I mean, it is becoming a topic of discussion now, which is good. So, I mean, that it's in the news.
There was a Wall Street Journal article titled Regulation Nation, too, about what's going on.
Same problem. So, I mean, it's very tough to be in business today in the United States, which we should be the easiest to be in business. The regulations. And every administration comes in and says, we're going to fix the bureaucracy, and of course they don't.
I know.
Because it is self-sustaining. So we've got some alternatives on how to do it and are fighting back to make it happen.
So the First Amendment, I know you you defend it so well, by the way, and it's something we've defended, but I view at this stage the IRS being that impediment, that if you say...
Well, we said that. I mean, we said the IRS is violating the free speech rights of these individual groups. In fact, in our responses back to the government, we said these questions and requests for information are outside the scope of legitimate inquiry and are protected by the First Amendment.
Very good.
Most of the time they back down. If they didn't, we fought them out and we'd win. So, but you had to get to that stage. But people don't look at the IRS and think First Amendment, but that's exactly what it is.
Very powerful argument, very powerful argument that.
What's happening is, by the way, it's the prior restraint where people fear if they say something.
That's still the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, the prior restraint, there's a prior restraint analysis within the First Amendment law, because the idea is if you intimidated people to speak, they won't speak. And that's a prior restraint, and it's called an unconstitutional prior restraint. I've litigated a lot of unconstitutional prior restraints over the last 30-something years.
Just one question that you may not be up to date with, or maybe you know more than anybody. The Regulatory Flexibility Act that mandates that the IRS put out for notice and comment really investigates something before they pass a regulation that's going to impact small business. Yeah. They seem to just ignore.
Well, they'll put out a request for comment, okay?
Okay.
And it pretty much doesn't mean much. It's rare that request, and some of these requests for comments, we get thousands of comments, but they're still, that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't require in that act they change the regulation.
Right.
It just says to get comments. So again, this is where accountability comes in. This is where government officials, you elect people. But look, elections have consequences, and elections have real consequences, and this is part of it.
Understood.
Yep.
Jay, tell us more about ACLJ here in the United States and elsewhere.
So we started in 1990 really, and so we were on over a quarter century. Done a lot of cases at the Supreme Court, but we branched out over the years. We got, as I said, involved in national security issues. We got involved in issues involving international governments. Did a lot of work on behalf of Israel. We've done a lot of work in the Middle East. We have offices in the East. We have offices in Africa. So a big office in Strasbourg, France. Very active at the United Nations, where we try to keep one of the most hostile international bodies off the backs of our allies, which is not an easy task, as you can imagine. But I've been to the International Criminal Court in The Hague on behalf of Israel, asserting Israel's arguments and positions. So it's a much broader agenda than when we first started in 1996. We have, with affiliates, hundreds of lawyers around the country. We have a large office in Washington, Virginia, Ann Arbor, Michigan, I mean all over the United States. And it's interesting. It's developed into what we call practice areas now. We subspecialize within the ACLJ. There are lawyers that are experts in national security. Others are experts in regulatory issues. Others are expert in First Amendment litigation or Supreme Court litigation. Others more international law. So it's a very broad-based organization that's got a big reach.
You've been described as one of Israel's greatest allies. Yeah. The Deputy Prime Minister of Israel said this about you recently.
Yeah. So I had the opportunity to present Israel's position before the International Criminal Court in The Hague on Operation Cast Lead. Cast Lead was the incursion with Gaza in 2009. It was horrendous. Rockets were pouring into Israel, into residential areas. People were being killed, and Israel retaliated as they should. It ends up the Palestinian Authority, for purely political reasons, takes it to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. My job was to convince the prosecutor that there was no case. First, that there was no jurisdiction. Palestinian Authority is not a state. Israel, like the United States, is not a member of the International Criminal Court. Ultimately, we were successful. We calculated the other day, there were probably 10,000 pages of documents filed in that case, on both sides.
Wow.
Yeah, we had a roundtable presentation in Geneva, at The Hague, where I made our position, Dory Gold was former ambassador for Israel. It was me, Dory Gold, Malcolm Shaw was a Queen's Counsel from Great Britain, and David Davenport, another lawyer in the United States. We made the argument on basically asserting Israel's position. The Palestinian Authority was represented by 4 lawyers, including one lawyer that represented the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, which of course is a terrorist organization, was then, and kind of tells you where their heads were.
Absolutely.
But ultimately we succeeded. We were successful with the Office of the Prosecutor.
I'm so grateful you asked that question, Richard, because Jay, I didn't know you were that big.
Yeah.
I didn't know how widespread.
So and each office kind of has its own unique personality and its unique what it carries. And the Washington office has to handle a lot. So there's multitasking there. You got international, regulatory, Supreme Court practice group. All of that's in one basic office.
How many attorneys do you have in Washington?
Right at any given time, about 10.
Okay.
Sometimes, and that because we've also have an office in Virginia, right across the way. Couple out, another one in Virginia. So if you put them both together, it's 20.
Okay.
So it's all specialized, and then we have hundreds of affiliates around the globe.
Fantastic.
Offices overseas that have. I mean, our office in Russia, I think they have 25 lawyers in Moscow. So we're engaged in a lot of areas. So a lot of depth.
Tremendous. American Center for Law and Justice.
ACLJ.org.
Yes, please. Yes.
And we've got a Facebook page, and I've got a Facebook page, and we get a lot of information out on social media. So you can put up there. That'll help too.
That's tremendous. Well, we're going to get this out on national TV.
Great. Appreciate it.
I have a question I want to ask you, and that is, what's your view on the fact that Israel seems to be singled out for special attention, lies by omission?
Condemnation is what it is. I mean, the more regular, there's more rules passed, resolutions passed on Israel than any other country in the world. You look at who makes up the Human Rights Council, some of the worst human rights abusers in the world, and they're passing judgment on Israel, the only democratic state in the region. But look, I mean, this is a fascinating time in Israeli history too, because when did you ever think you would see the allies in the Middle East being Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, and Jordan, which you do today?
It seems like history is being unwound. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of last century seems to be going back into another situation. But again, it is tragic to see the Arab Spring deteriorating into this nightmare.
We had an opportunity in the United States. You had 1 million people on the square in Tehran. We did nothing. You had millions of people go into, which were all Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, to get rid of our ally. Not a great guy, Mubarak, but our ally. We get rid of him. We don't want to touch the Ayatollah. So you got Iran. The biggest export of terrorism in the world is Iran. The biggest.
Yep.
The only reason they're mad at Turkey is because Turkey also wants to establish a caliphate, and the only reason both of them are mad at ISIS is because ISIS did establish the caliphate, or attempt to. So this is but the Middle East is going through a transformation. You mentioned Sykes-Picot. I'll tell you what, if you look back in 1919, the settlement of World War I, and the division of the Middle East into mandates. I go to a program every summer at Oxford, spend about 3 or 4 weeks, either lecturing or involved in programs. And this last year I read all of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, because he kind of the precursor to the Arab Spring, but he was also a Zionist. And there was a document nobody ever talks about, Chaim Weizmann and King Faisal, the Weizmann-Faisal document, where the Arab leader, King Faisal, who we made the leader, the Allies made the leader because of his work in helping in World War I, made a deal with Chaim Weizmann, welcoming the Jews back to their homeland. That's in the document.
Interesting.
It was the British that promised that same land. They called it, Lawrence said it this way, it's the ABCs of Britain politics. A, we promise it to the Jews. B, we promise the land to the Arabs. C, we meant to keep it for ourselves the whole time. And so I read all of Lawrence last year, read Disraeli the year before, because Disraeli was the precursor on Zionism, even before Herzl. He wrote the Jewish Question pamphlet. that was basically and Herzl, of course, in the Zionist era, was the leading, proponent of Zionism as we know it. But I mean, look, it's a complicated mess, and you say it's a retrospect. Look at the retrospect. The Soviet Union collapses. They haven't been involved in the Middle East since really 1991, and now, full force. Where's their ally? It's Russia, Iran, and Syria. This is an unholy alliance that is going to be very dangerous. I've got a book coming out later in the year just on that point. It is a very dangerous time in the Middle East.
Absolutely, very much so. How do you see the challenges facing the United States at this odd time in history?
Well, the challenges are great. I mean, the challenges are great. But, my grandfather came to this country and he was 14 years old. Russian immigrant, escaping religious persecution. He was a fruit peddler in Brooklyn, New York. His name was Sam Sekulow. It was really Shmulik Sokolov was the name. Sokolov. And his grandson gets to argue cases before the Supreme Court of the United States. It's a pretty good country. It's a pretty great country.
It is.
It's the best in the world. And now I look at my own grandchildren. And now the question we have to ask ourselves, those of us that have children or grandchildren, is what are we leaving to them? What is it we're passing on? We got a national security nightmare right now. I think we're at pre-9/11 levels of tension right now. And how are we gonna do this? How are we gonna do that? So I think, look, the challenges are great, but we are Americans. We are up for the challenge. I really believe it.
Well, what's required is economic growth in order for that to happen.
Of course.
And we're viewing the Internal Revenue Service as an impediment to
Well, they are.
a huge impediment. And if we don't do something about that, we're going to be constantly stymied. Entrepreneurs won't be able to move their invention forward because of bureaucrats.
Well, that's why everything's done overseas now. Nothing's done in the United States. We don't do, we have no service industry. We have service industries. We don't have any manufacturing in the United States anymore.
Right.
We can afford to do it.
Right.
And that's the problem. Who wants to deal with the regulatory environment of doing it? So Apple, great technology in the United States, made in China.
Yeah.
Yeah, and on it goes. I don't even know where this book was printed. I mean, I don't, because the publisher printed it, but I'm assuming it was the United States, but I'll assume it's mine they did. But the fact is you don't know. And I can guarantee you that the jacket I'm wearing and the shirt I'm wearing probably were not made in the United States. What happened? We've lost an entire industry. How did that happen? Regulatory. Whether it was the Trade Commission, whether it was the IRS. We haven't even talked about the National Labor Relations Board and the way they hit Boeing.
Yeah.
I mean, companies that do business in the United States, we're going to have them not do business in the United States?
It's frightening.
I mean, it's scary. So, look, at the end of the day, I'm optimistic. I have great hope. The Constitution survives. The Republic survives. We live to fight another day. But the fight goes on.
Well, Jay, you're doing a spectacular job. Spectacular getting this information out. And I feel a personal mission to disseminate this to
I appreciate that very much.
Personal mission.
Thank you very much.
Jay, it's been a real privilege and pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. Glad we were able to work it out. Good seeing you.
Fantastic, Jay.
Thanks for having me.
I'll be right back.